So, how did this project come about? Well, a couple of years ago, I bought a GS550 in bits. I was aware that it was missing a few parts, but I went ahead and bought it anyway because it was super cheap. Got it home. One of the parts that was missing was the seat, and I'd bought a replacement seat off eBay. So I put the tank and the tailpiece and the seat on the frame, and I tried to get them all to line up, and it just wouldn't. There was no way it was going to line up. So I did a bit more digging, and it turns out the frame wasn't from a GS550, it was from a 550 Katana. A completely different frame, no way any of the parts were really going to fit. So since it was a 550 and not the more sort of valuable 750 or 1000, I just thought, bugger it, we'll make something fun out of it, cafe racer it or something like that. So I started doing a bit of work on that, and then it got shelved because other projects came along. One of those projects being a GS750. Now, I was having some issues with the carbs on the GS750 because I didn't have a stock airbox for it. So I got this idea in my head, why not turn it into fuel injection? Because I've had a couple of fuel injected bikes and they're just so much easier to deal with than carburetors. Much more reliable, much easier to tune as long as you've got the right software and the right kind of fuel injection. So I just thought, yeah, give that a go. Meantime though, I managed to source the right airbox. I got the carbs set up right, but I'd bought all of this stuff. So I decided not to use it on the GS750. So now I'm thinking I'll just use it on the GS550 instead. So that project's come out of hibernation, and I've got all these bits, and we're going to see if we can get it working with fuel injection instead of carburetors. So yeah. So what is it? What is this lot? It's all off a Triumph TT600, and the reason I went with that is because I've had one in the past. I have an idea of how the fuel injection works on it. Yeah, and it's fairly simple fuel injection. There's not a lot to it. It's easy to get into the ECU using free software and remap it and all that stuff as well. So I just thought, yeah, I'm familiar with the stuff. Let's try it and see what happens. Plus, as a 600, the TT600 produces up to about 110 horsepower at max RPM. So it gives you a nice wide area to work within. I think the GS550 only produces about 42, so the fuel injectors should have more than enough volume to cope with their needs. So, yeah, as far as what I've purchased, obviously ECU, this is off a TT600. I don't know what year. That has a built-in barometric air pressure sensor that's normally plumbed into the airbox. But I've read that people find the bike runs quite fine without the plumbing, just leaving it open. So as long as it can sense ambient air pressure, you're okay. Then I've got the fuel rail and injectors. And I've taken this apart, but it does have a pressure sensor, a pressure regulator on one end, and the inlet pipe on the other end. And then there's an outlet pipe over here with your 4 injectors. This is one of those systems that has a circuit with a return to the fuel tank. So the fuel pump is constantly running, and then the pressure regulator just regulates the pressure within the rail. So very straightforward stuff, nothing complicated controlling the fuel pump or anything like that. So, and that's already got your fuel injectors attached, so that's fine. Then crankshaft position sensor. This is also off a TT600. This picks up some teeth on a rotor that sits behind the alternator on the left-hand side of the engine. It's quite a big ring with some teeth on it. I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to work this out on the GS, because I'd like to put this in the other side of the engine under the points cover, because that'll require the least amount of modification. So I'll have to make up some kind of ring. I'm not sure how well they scale down, especially considering the standard TT600 ring has a 10-degree tooth spacing, so 36 teeth, although it has extra teeth and gaps for the datum. But it is 10 degrees, so that I'm not sure how well that's going to scale down, but we'll have to see. That's one of the big unknowns about all of this right now. Also, you've got a coolant temperature sensor. There's an inlet air temperature sensor, so this goes in the air box normally. And then you've got your actuator here for your idle air control valve. Bear in mind, fuel-injected engines, the engine management likes to control the idle speed, so that's what this is for. And then there's a bunch of hoses that connect to that. These are the little guys that connect that to your air source. Haven't quite worked out how I'm going to do that yet. Then obviously you've got the all-important throttle bodies. Now these, they come with the throttle position sensor attached already. And then I've fitted these sort of pod filters on there. Previously, when I was looking at putting them on the GS750, with a little modification, these sponge filters went straight on. I haven't decided if I'm going to keep them or make an airbox or put some trumpets on. I don't know what. I've already cut some bits of hose to fit the ends on the engine side of the throttle bodies. My plan was to machine some aluminium adapters. I 3D printed some just as a test to see if it would work, if I could get it all lined up, and I was quite successful. The fuel injectors actually inject directly into the cylinder head rather than into the throttle bodies, so I incorporated that into these little adapters, little manifolds, and it all worked fine. Everything fitted fine. Obviously 3D printed, it's just a test. My plan was to machine some out of aluminium, but I never got around to doing that, so I'll have to make some new ones to suit the GS550 spacing and see how that works out. I've already had a look at that. It does look quite feasible, but the idea being those attach with the rubber hose and a hose clamp, and then the injectors sit there and inject straight in. I had not decided which way up yet. If there was enough space, I would have preferred to have had the injectors underneath, but I don't think there is on the GS550. I think the cam chain tensioner will get in the way, so I think I will have to have the injectors above the throttle bodies, but it's all doable. The angle that they meet that will probably be determined by the space I have available and the amount of excess length that it creates. But it seems perfectly doable. A few unknowns. First one I mentioned, the triggers for the crankshaft position sensor. I'm not 100% sure how that's going to work or even if that's going to work. So I'll machine up a sort of a trial and see if that works at all. Obviously, the other big unknown is if I connect this all up to the wiring, is this thing even going to come alive? Is it even going to work? I don't know, to be fair. I've also purchased some wiring. This is a TT600 main harness and a TT600 engine harness. It's all been stripped and cleaned, so I can see what the hell's going on, because I'm slightly colorblind, so I need to be able to see these wires quite well. One thing about this system, the TT600, is it has a crankshaft position sensor, but it doesn't have a camshaft position sensor. So it does a bit of electronic magic to work out which cylinder is on the intake stroke and which cylinder is not. Because obviously without a cam sensor, it needs to sort of work that out. I believe it test injects and test ignites to see if it results in combustion and then makes decisions based on that. Sounds pretty damn complicated, but it just means that for this setup, I only need a crankshaft position sensor. I don't need to start modifying the cylinder head to be able to install a camshaft position sensor, which is great. Also, the wiring harness, there's a separate harness just for the engine, which is really helpful, with all the connectors on it for all the sensors on the engine and the actuators. It only talks to the main harness through relays and fuses, so it'd be quite easy to take that engine harness and graft it into the GS550 harness. So I don't think it'll be too difficult. Bear in mind, I'm no expert on wiring. In fact, I'm pretty shit at wiring, but it's a bit of perseverance and take it slow, and I think it's doable. So yeah, one of the first things I'm going to have to do is take the main harness to bits, cut out the bits I need, identify all the plugs on the engine harness, connect everything up, connect it up to my laptop, and fire up Tune ECU, which is the program you use to get into this ECU. Incidentally, that's one of the other reasons why I like this setup, is because it's an open loop system. It does not use an oxygen sensor in the exhaust, so you don't need to modify the exhaust at all. And also, this ECU is quite open and accessible through the Tune ECU software. You can change the fuel mapping, you can change ignition mapping, you can have a look at the status of all the actuators and the sensors. So it's quite easy to work with this ECU. Obviously, it is a bit more restricted than if you were to use a standalone sort of open source ECU like Speeduino or one of the Mega Squirts or something like that. I don't know if they can handle a system without a cam position sensor, so I don't know. I mean, if I can't get this to work, what I'll do is I'll look at, say, the Speeduino, for instance, and then look at installing a cam sensor. But as long as that works, I won't need to, which will be great. So yes, this is the standard Triumph TT600 plate for the fuel tank. Normally this would have the fuel pump and filter on it, but obviously I don't really want to make that kind of modification, so I'm not going to be running an in-tank filter, but I've kept this because it's got the connector on and it's got the low fuel level sensor on, which might still work. But yeah, so as for fuel pump, I purchased this beast. This is not an in-tank pump, this is an external pump, so we'll have to see if this works. Because it's constantly on, I figure just a bog standard fuel pump will probably work, 12 volts. It's got a pressure regulator, so it should be fine. I have experimented a bit with fuel pumps. I mean, the last project I worked on was a BMW K1200S, and the fuel pump went, and I replaced it with a aftermarket Ford Focus fuel pump. So I think they're pretty much all the same. I don't think it really matters, as long as it pumps fuel and manages to maintain that pressure. And then since the fuel pump is going to be external, I will then be using this external fuel filter, which is quite a big one. So we'll have to see how that goes. I've got to find somewhere to stick all this stuff in the bike, but it shouldn't be too hard. As I said, Cafe Racer, but I do plan to keep the battery in its original location, so that gives me a bit of space for fuses and pumps and filters and ECUs and things. Plus there's always the seat hump if I need to stick anything in there. I'll probably actually stick the ECU in there. I've got a nice long bit of this tubing to connect it to, if I need to plumb the ambient pressure sensor into somewhere at the front of the bike. I don't know, we'll have to see. But yeah, that's where it would normally live, so I'm sure the wiring harness will be long enough to get it there anyway. So yeah, another thing about the TT600 that's quite handy is, although there is no Haynes manual for it, weirdly, there is the Triumph service manual. The original factory service manual is available, floating around on the internet. It's not hard to find. So I have a copy. I've printed a bunch of bits out, things like wiring diagrams and things. Very useful stuff. It shows individual circuits for the individual sensors and actuators and how they connect through the main harness. So for someone like me that's not all that good at wiring, that's ideal. So yeah, just to recap, a few of the reasons I went with this: because it's open-ended. It's not it's open loop rather than closed loop, so it doesn't use an oxygen sensor. It's easy to get into the ECU using free software, and it looks about up to the job. So we'll see what happens going forward, but the first thing we're going to do is try and get some life into that ECU, connect it up to a laptop, see what maps are already loaded onto it, and make sure that we get feedback from all the sensors, that it is actually showing and displaying an ambient pressure and temperature and all of that. Make sure that this IOCV actuator actually actuates, because it should cycle when you switch the power on. So that'll be the first thing we do. And once I know we've got life with that ECU and all of these other bits are actually working and it can read throttle position and all of that, move on to the next thing, which will be attempting to create a rotor that will work with the stock crankshaft position sensor and actually be able to trigger the injectors. So if we get that far, then I feel like that ECU will work. If we don't, I might have to try something else. But in the meantime, yeah, this is where we are. Thanks for watching.